Hi, this is Shambhavi. Welcome to my weekly podcast about spirituality, love, death, devotion, and waking up while living in a messy world. The Satsang with Shambhavi podcast is recorded live each week with students of our nonprofit community, Jayakula. For more information and to find out about attending a satsang, visit jayakula.org. Thanks for listening. Much love to you, wherever and however you are. Some days ago, I heard a very well-respected Rinpoche, and also a Rinpoche that I respect a lot, give a teaching on the coronavirus on Facebook, where he said that if we are more realized, I'm condensing what he said, if we are more realized, we won't get sick. If we have more what he's called bodhicitta, we won't get sick. Or if we're maybe somewhat more realized, we'll only get a little sick. We won't get very sick. And he said this was because of our karma. Because we have negative karma, that's why we get sick. So again, with all respect to this teacher, who's a wonderful practitioner, this is a wrong teaching from my perspective, and my perspective in my traditions, but also just my perspective from the fruit of my practice, from my direct experience. And I hope that today, most of these teachings can come out of my experience. That's what I'm sharing with you, and not out of a book. So the absolute teaching is that there is no karma. The word karma means bound activity. It means activity that has some kind of limitation that repeats itself in time, repeats itself in linear time. We also have another word, which is kriya. And kriya means unbound or unconditioned activity. It means spontaneity. It means activity that is not conditioned by past, present, or future. It's not conditioned by what happened before. It's not conditioned by cause and effect. It's not conditioned by concepts or ideas. It's spontaneously arising as in a call and response way to whatever the circumstances that we find ourselves in. So the trajectory of the spiritual practitioner, from my perspective, is that we start off with some bound activity, compulsive activities, fixations, repetitions, habits of body, energy, and mind. And we do a lot of sadhana, and we work with our teachers and our communities, and those patterns begin to resolve. And then we become more spontaneous. We become more spontaneous and less conditioned in our self-expression. So what is the limitation that karma represents? This is the crux of the issue, I think. Most of us either grew up in or have been impacted by, because of the countries that we live in, the gods of the Abrahamic traditions. The gods of Islam, of Judaism, and of Christianity. Those gods are operating on an axis of reward and punishment. So we are very used to thinking of our actions as either garnering reward or garnering punishment. And many of us seek rewards and we try to avoid punishment. And even some of us are living as if we had an anvil over our head, like 3 inches over our head, and we're just constantly waiting for it to drop on us for having done something wrong or making a mistake or being sinful or something like that. So when we come to an idea of karma, by and large, we interpret it through this lens of reward and punishment. And we feel like when someone says karma is a product of limitation, we think it means our sinfulness or our mistakenness or our wrongness or even our evilness or our badness. And then some opposite of that, our goodness, our doing everything right, our following all the rules in the right way, or being a good person through our everyday actions. So we tend to reinterpret karma this way. And we feel, I think, in my opinion, is that we often feel more comfortable with certain Buddhist traditions if we encounter them, if we grew up in an Abrahamic tradition, because they talk about things in some of those traditions, not all of them, things like accumulating merit and making good cause for liberation, and those kinds of concepts that we are very familiar with from our Abrahamic traditions. But the absolute teaching is that there is no karma. And the only limitation, this is the linchpin, the limitations that we experience are not because we're good or bad, or mistaken or correct, or evil or holy, or anything like that. The limitation, there's only one limitation. We have more access to wisdom, or we have less access to wisdom. This is what one of the founders of Trika Shaivism taught, Abhinavagupta. The only limitation is having incomplete access to wisdom. There's no sin, there's no evil, there's no wrongness, there's nothing to blame. The only limitation is having incomplete access to wisdom. So karma is how we behave or think or feel when we have incomplete access to wisdom. That's on a relative level. On an absolute level, there is no activity happening here that is not totally enlightened. So what is wisdom? What is this wisdom that we have an experience of being incompletely given access to? Wisdom is what everything is made out of. So wisdom is the essential beneficence of all of reality. Wisdom is the compassion that permeates every pore of reality. Wisdom is the vast intelligence of this reality. Wisdom is the unstoppable grace that is being expressed by this reality all the time. These are my own experiences I'm talking about now. When we do this kind of practice and we encounter the fundamental nature of reality, we encounter goodness without an opposite. Sometimes in these traditions, you'll hear this described as auspiciousness or beneficence. We encounter kindness without an opposite. We encounter compassion without an opposite. We encounter all of the wisdom, what I call wisdom virtues, in full measure without opposites in all of reality. If we were to look through the eyes of a realized practitioner, this is what we would see. Only beneficence, only mercy, only intelligence, only compassion, only playfulness, only clarity. These are some of the wisdom virtues. So there cannot be negative karma. There cannot be punishment. There cannot be you being a bad person, because you are made of all of those wisdom virtues. You are an aspect of God playing at experiencing a limitation. One of the examples I like to use, because it's just funny, is a soap opera. Sometime when I was younger, I don't really remember when this happened, someone took our class to a movie studio or TV studio where they were filming a soap opera. I don't know which one it was or why we went there, but it was kind of hilarious because, you know, the interiors of houses in soap operas are just these hideous McMansions. So inside of this studio was like this living room set of a hideous McMansion living room. And we just all went and looked at it. So the idea is that you're an actor in this soap opera. And you're having fun playing all these parts. And you're playing the part of someone who's really, really bad at being married. You've been married a lot of times and your marriages always end in divorce. But in real life, you have a wonderful marriage and you're actually really good at relationships. But you're enjoying playing the part of someone who doesn't have that wisdom about how to relate well. And then one day you forget that you're on this soap opera set. And so now you think that you really have these limitations. And now you have problems. Now you have suffering. So this is exactly our situation. There is one reality that is playing all of these parts. And the natural way that all of these infinite number of circumstances get created is through this process of apparent limitation. Apparent limitation. And then we get to have this wonderful exploration we call a spiritual path. And we are really just that reality having fun being on this path. That's the absolute view. What is the relative view? The relative view is expressed by Lord Krishna to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita. He says, you have been made this way. You've been made a warrior. I've made you this way, basically. I've created you in this form, and now you must play your part. You must play your part. And that leads directly to the question of what is the part, the relative part of a spiritual practitioner who has limited understanding of wisdom and who hopefully would have the understanding that any explanation that you give for why something is happening is like a little fence that you put up in the unending vastness of wisdom. And then you put your little flag there in this tiny little speck surrounded by your fence of I know. And you tell your story in that tiny, tiny little space. So we as practitioners or just people who care about other people, we want to be extremely vigilant with ourselves, ruthless with ourselves, about making up stories that purport to say why something like this is happening. We must examine ourselves. Do we actually know that? Do we have embodied experience of this? Or is this just something that sounds good to our minds or satisfies something in our hearts, like the need to feel safe? Oh, I'm protected. I am a great spiritual practitioner. I'll either just get it mildly or I won't get it at all. Famous Rinpoche said so. We have to ruthlessly examine our ideas about this kind of thing, our explanations and other people's explanations for this. When we are in the field of karma, the field of bound activity, the field of imperfect access to wisdom, then we have the experience of the karmic events in time that go into producing any one particular phenomenon as being absolutely infinite and unexplainable and undescribable. So for instance, let's say I have some explanation about why my karma is good and I'm not going to get sick. I did X, Y, and Z for my whole life. Or I was nice to other people. Or I had great teachers bless me in temples or something like that. And I feel I'm not going to get this. Well, this phenomenon of me has infinite more phenomenon feeding into it that produce this. Infinitely unknowable streams of events through vast amounts of time. So for me to say I'm not going to get sick because I did these 2 or 3 things in this life is absurd. It's just absurd. And you just can't know. One of the things that happens when you do a lot of practice is that you start to have memories, or who knows if they're really memories, of some things that happened to this, that somehow got bound up in this phenomena in this life that came from somewhere else. And we call those things our past lives. You know, we don't really know if they're our past lives. We don't really know the status of those memories. But somehow they inform this life. And they can be very useful. They can also be distracting, but they can be very useful. But there's something beyond that. There's something beyond having those kinds of linear memories. And that is when your inner eyes start to open and your senses start to open, and the vast fragments of other lives that somehow are related to this come pouring in. And that's when you realize, telling the story about my past life this, my past life that, as if you definitely have this information and know how to situate it, know how to characterize it, or having some definite thought about, I did this and it led to this happening or not happening. That's when you realize that kind of explanation is so inadequate that inadequate is an inadequate word. Because there's just an unending treasure chest of places, people, times, events, circumstances, feelings that have come into this. You also start to realize when the floodgates open and you start having these memories or whatever they are, the importance of them goes way down. Because there's just so much of it. There's just so much of it. I also want to talk about two more things, and then we'll have open satsang. The first one is about doubt. That teaching that I heard from that wonderful Rinpoche was not the first one that I've heard since this started. In fact, I've heard maybe 6 or 7 of these things, also from very well-respected teachers, saying similar things or talking about how this is a good time for us without ever even mentioning anything about all the people for whom this is a terrible time. So I want to say 2 things about that. One is about doubt. Doubt is when we ask questions from a place of actually wanting to know. Getting angry and outraged at people and accusing people of stuff is not productive of greater wisdom for us or anybody else. That's just taking one stance and pitting it against another stance. Nor is it useful to just follow along with what wise or supposedly wise people say and accept what they say just based on the fact that they have a title or somebody else thinks they're great or they have a great spiritual resume. Our relationship to teachers, even the very best teachers on the planet, should be we feel something from them, something direct and alive that we feel confidence in. And when we have questions about what they're teaching, we ask those questions. So it's okay to ask these questions. It doesn't matter who you are or how, spiritually lowly you are. It's asking questions from a place of really wanting to know is absolutely the best attitude that you can have toward any teaching or any teacher. So I just wanted to put that out there because we hear a lot of these things from people in robes and people with incredible spiritual resumes. And then it becomes, in a sense, people are afraid to ask questions about it. And I know that's not the case of all of you, but I just wanted to put that out there, that we should check in with our own hearts and not be afraid to ask the real questions that will lead to actual understanding. The second thing I want to say is that compassion is built into the nature of reality. It has no reason. There's no, I'm compassionate because. There's no, I'm cultivating compassion. There's no, I am compassionate. There's no limitation to compassion. It's a natural outflow from every pore of reality. And when we're in a circumstance like we are in, our access to that natural compassion is evidenced by how large of a sphere we naturally care about in our day-to-day lives. When people are only concerned about how things affect them, we call that selfishness. Right? When people are only concerned about their friends and their family and their neighborhood, we might not even notice that that's selfishness, but it is definitely limited. And then we have others, people who have a much larger sphere of concern. Most of you care about what happens to other people in the world who you aren't directly related to. But when we forget that other people are having an experience different from our own, that is evidence of less than full access to this natural wisdom of compassion. The result of taking that on as a truth, for instance, that some people are getting sick only because they have bad karma. They've done something bad. They haven't been good practitioners. The result of that is cruelty. And another thing I want to say is that as a spiritual teacher, I feel a lot of responsibility for what I put out into the interwebs. Because I know a lot of people are going to hear what I write or what I say who cannot ask me questions, or think they can anyway, who cannot clarify what I mean, who can't go deeper. They're only going to hear the words, and they're going to hear them in whatever way they hear them. So any of you who are in public talking about what's going on, or maybe you're a spiritual teacher too, be very cautious about what you say. For instance, saying that people get sick only because their karma is negative in some way feeds into a lot of spiritual bypassing, racism, all kinds of things that we really don't want to contribute to as practitioners or teachers. You have to think about who could possibly hear this. What might they think of it? Right? How is this going to actually support people in their limited ideas and their fixations rather than help people? This is an aspect of compassion too, to not just to think of other people and how other people's lives are, but to think of how the words you put out, especially in our situation now where so many people hear the words that teachers say. How might they be interpreted, and how might they cause more suffering? This is all relative teaching. How might they cause more suffering in unintended ways? Back in ancient times, when teachers like me were teaching, they only taught a small number of people. And if they wrote anything, it would be like a manual just for their students. They didn't mean anybody else to have these teachings. We're not in this situation now. And I really think that out of compassion for everyone, we really need to stop and think about the impact that our words might have in different communities and different circumstances, and people who are going to interpret things through various lenses, including very harmful lenses that might even underwrite or encourage someone to be violent towards somebody else, or dismissive or cold or cruel. So we really need to think about this. This isn't about not accumulating more karma. It's not about being a better person. It's about getting in the river of compassion, really feeling it, letting yourself feel toward other people and how what you do might have impacts on other people in a relative sense in real time. So again, it's not about doing the right thing. It's not about being better. It's not about fixing yourself. It's about actually opening your heart, and letting your heart care about the widest number of beings possible. Having that big view, having that big feeling for beings, not just human beings. So karma is not punishment or reward. Karma is simply the natural condition of the natural self-arising nature of this reality to create experiences for itself that have some apparent limitation in their access to wisdom. There is no blame to go around. And there is no explanation that will explain why something like this is happening. The desire to have an explanation is completely fear-based. How should we relate to it, though, if we don't have an explanation? We relate to it as a moment-to-moment experience that we are trying to derive wisdom from, moment to moment, and that we are using to continually open our hearts as deeply as we can and as widely as we can. And we don't need to know why it's happening. We only need to work with it to help us to open our hearts. We don't need explanations like karma to get through this.
Quick question. Glad you're talking about this topic. Sometimes I get confused around the topic of karma. Can you talk a bit about the cause and effect piece of karma? I know you said there's no use to have an explanation, but isn't it true that our actions have consequences in a relative sense, and ignorant action has effects that ripple out? Thanks.
Mm-hmm. The problem with explaining or defining karma as a law of cause and effect is that it comes out of Western rationalistic, materialist, scientific thinking, or at least it gets inflected by that very, very strongly. And then we think we actually can know what the cause is and what the effect is. And then we're back in the arena of very, very bound, limited knowledge or understanding that doesn't take into account the vastness of wisdom. So I prefer to say, on a relative sense, that karma is about call and response, not cause and effect. Call and response, first of all, opens us to the fact that we are in an alive, aware situation, that reality itself is alive and aware, and that when we are acting, that we are in a conversation with reality, and then we are being responded to. And that response is multivalent. It has many different parts and layers. When we do something, this alive reality is not just responding to us, it's responding also to anyone in our circumstance and other beings that we don't even know about. So the mandala of call and response for any particular action that we might take is huge. Mandala of beings and flows of results and responses from that is huge. There are repercussions for what we do, or we can say responses that we get responded to. But first of all, we cannot predict that response. We may get into a very small eddy where we try, for instance, we act in a certain way over and over and over and over and over again. And most of the time we get some kind of response that's in the same genre. But we still don't know that that's going to happen every single time. No matter how hard we try to always get the response of making enough money to pay our rent, we can never be guaranteed of that response. No matter how honest we are, and I can tell you this as a teacher, no matter how honest we are, there's always going to be somebody who thinks we're not honest. We can't control that. We have absolutely no control over what the response is going to be. And we also don't know, when we take a step, what the outcome of that is going to be. So this is, for some people, a devastating situation. But in other circumstances, it's a situation that allows a lot of freshness into our lives. So on a limited scale, some of the time we can know, or at least know with some percentage of certainty, what might happen. For instance, I know if I ate twice as much food as I eat now, I'd be a lot fatter. That's a very limited kind of knowing. But you know, maybe Ma could step in and make that not happen. I don't know. Probably she won't, because it's like so totally unimportant. But on a bigger scale, we really don't know. So think of it as call and response, that you're in a living situation, and that the conversation that you're having with reality is a mandala, not just a telephone line with thin communication going in two directions.
I wanted to ask about, expanding that sense of care to embrace as many living beings as possible, and sort of just this, for me personally, I guess the sense of like desperation and sometimes hopelessness that comes with that, to just like, I don't know, to feel that suffering or witness that suffering. It's not really a question. I'm just curious what you have to say about it.
Well, to relate to that in a relative sense, understanding that we are immersed in wisdom, the basic circumstance or the basic situation that we're in is that we have been placed in that position by this vastly intelligent, alive, aware reality. And that is our circumstance that we are working with. Period. And your grief, we all feel grief, or if we feel anything, there's a lot of grief to be felt in the human condition. We feel a lot of other things too. That's just part of the circumstance that you're in. You're on this planet. You're living the life you're living. You're experiencing this period of time. And you're feeling grief for these reasons. And you even feel some hopelessness. That's part of your circumstance. But as a practitioner, the circumstance with relation to hopelessness should be a more work person-like relationship to those circumstances. Note your hopeless feeling, but then get up and say to yourself, this is where Ma placed me. This is where I am. I'm not going to be somewhere else, no matter how I feel. This is what I have to work with. This is what Namkhai Norbu always said. We work with circumstance. You could say we play with circumstance. You could say we work with circumstance. Whatever you want to say, but this is it. Part of being in presence and taking your seat is to work with what the circumstance that you're in, regardless of whether you wish it were something else or not. This is where you are. This is where you'll be. These are the feelings you feel, and this is the material that you have to work with. So it's a very practical relationship to that. So feel hopeless a little, but don't get stuck there, because then hopelessness means you're not working with it. And sometimes we feel hopeless out of a sense of ego or of hubris, because we are only satisfied when we're doing something really grand to fix things or help things. But maybe your place in life is not to be doing grand things.